I'm still here.
Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 5 of the World's 2024 Swiss stage. I am very excited to get into this. Unfortunately, this is a very big day in the Swiss stage because by the end of this video, our first 2 teams will be eliminated from the main stage of Worlds 2024. We will know every team that's moving on to round 3. We will know all of the matchups going into round number 3, so a lot to go over here today. We're back into the best of 3s after some best of 1s yesterday, but best of 3s are now here to stay. The best of 1s are over. We had our last day of best of 1s yesterday, so very excited to start getting into more concrete series as we go throughout. Of course, you can check out my thoughts and opinions on everything that's happened at this tournament up in the iCard. I'm going to link that up, of course, there. You can check out my pre-tournament coverage, all of the play-in coverage, all of the days of the Swiss stage have been covered up in that playlist. You can check out days 1 and 2 in particular for the 4 teams that will be playing today, but of course, days 3 and 4 to cover the other round 2 matchups or the round 3 matchups or whatever you want to call them, right? But of course, today we will be talking about our 0-2 matchups, our best of 3s to determine who will survive and who will be the first 2 teams to go home. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in each series, and of course I will be giving a player of the series at the end of each series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. I assume we will have the draw at the end of this video. I'm recording this as games are going on, and so we will likely be talking about what's going to be happening in the future in the 2-1 and 1-2 series at the end of the video, but most of today will be spent talking about these 0-2 matchups. So without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. Our first series of the day here is probably the more interesting one to me personally, mostly because of the playstyles of these 2 teams, but the 2 best performing teams coming out of the play-in stage having to face off against each other to see who will be going home first. It's the number 3 seed from the LEC in Mad Lions Koi taking on the number 1 seed from the VCS in GAM Esports. I think this matchup is very intriguing on paper because you're looking at teams that play very differently and play through very different stages of the map. You're looking at a team in Mad Lions that I think has really thrived off of playing through bot lane throughout this entire tournament. The play-in stage was basically all through Supa and Alvaro, and honestly, I'm not going to try and sit here and say I'm a genius or whatever, because to me it was very obvious, but I'm really glad I stuck to my guns and talked Supa and Alvaro up so much going into the tournament. There was a lot of negativity surrounding them throughout basically the entire year domestically, because the LEC fans love to hate on anybody that tries to be cocky and confident that they don't already love, and so Supa coming out and saying how good of an AD carry he is, being like very funnily confident, I think got under a lot of people's skin, but this guy's really good. Alvaro's been really good. They were top 2 in Rookie of the Year voting for me in the LEC, and obviously that was not a very popular opinion with how good Jackie's was, but I really do think they've been exceptionally good throughout the entire year, and I think now people are starting to notice, now that the narrative isn't quite as self-contained to just domestic play and just LEC fans, I do think that there is a much wider breadth of, oh, Mad plays a lot through Supa and Alvaro. They put a lot of time and resources into making sure they're comfortable, and they've been great at this tournament. Now, that being said, they're not consistent by any stretch of the imagination. They are the most consistent part of this team, but that is kind of the problem, right? Is these are not consistent pieces. These are not players that are good every single game. They're still young rookies, if you will. Like, it's their first year at the top level of a major professional league, and they show that sometimes. There are games that they just completely run it down. We've seen it at times at this tournament already on days 1 and 2. too, and so there are some concerns with Supa and Alvaro if they're going to be your primary carries, and that's not necessarily helped by the fact that I think the solo laners have just been really bad at this tournament. Unfortunately, that was also kind of predictable by me. I've never really been a huge fan of Mirwin. I've been very vocal about that on the channel throughout the entire year as we've covered the LEC. I just don't think his laning is particularly good if he doesn't have the element of surprise. He's often down in CS. He's not really that much of an impact in team fights in comparison to some of his contemporaries. He can have some really good moments. It's just not particularly consistent at all for him, and there are a lot of bad moments that go with that, and Fresskowy has really just been bad at this tournament. He was okay in the play-in stage because everybody else was winning, and so it was really easy for him to play out some of these mid to late games, even though he was losing 1v1 in terms of CS, but he's been exposed a lot more in the main stage for just not being good enough in lane, and I think that's going to be something that we continue to monitor. Now, this matchup's pretty good for him because GAM's biggest weakness is their mid lane on the other side, so you have to hope that Fresskowy's going to be able to get it together, but if Elyoya in the jungle can have a really good series, and if you can get Supa and Alvaro going, if Mirwin or Fresskowy can step up and play really well in this series, Mad's going to be able to take it home relatively easily. They're favorites in this series by a large margin for a reason. That's because they really only need one of those things to go right in order to be able to take this. But GAM, they have some things going for them as well. I actually think they have a pretty fantastic matchup here in the top lane. Kiaya is an absolute menace. He has been for years. We've talked about it over and over again on this channel. Basically every single time we cover an international tournament, I'm hyping up how good Kiaya was domestically, and then GAM comes out and is just fine at the World Championships or at MSI or whatever, right? Because it's just hard. But Kiaya could abuse Mirwin. That is absolutely a matchup that I would be looking at if I was GAM and saying, like, we have to not lane swap. We have to do anything that we possibly can to try to get these two in the same lane against each other because we need Kiaya to be able to generate those advantages. Because if they take Kiaya out of the game, I really think it's going to be a lot harder for GAM to be able to win in any meaningful way. Levi's pretty good in the jungle, obviously. He's a player that I think is a little bit overhyped at the current moment. Very solid, but I would expect Elyoya to be able to out-jungle him, and then the rest of this map has just not been particularly consistent. Emo and Elio in particular have some real problems. Easy Love, I think, can definitely step up if needed. I was actually pseudo-impressed with his tape coming into the tournament, as I've talked about, but Emo is maybe one of the worst players at the entire tournament. Elio has struggled in terms of being able to consistently maintain pressure, and especially when you're going into someone like Alvaro, who's very good at playing the map. There's just going to be a lot of pressure on those two players. Again, if GAM wants to win, they're going to have to step up. Emo's going to have a good series. Elio's going to have a good series. But if you can get Kiaya rolling, if you can even get someone like Easy Love rolling, which I think is possible as well here, I could definitely see a world in which GAM has enough firepower and enough talent to be able to win some 5v5s if they win early. But at the end of the day, Mad's definitely going to be favorited in those scenarios because they're more consistent in terms of winning in the early game, and I think they have a little bit more talent in terms of the team fights as well. So that's kind of the expectation going into a series like this, but GAM went undefeated in the play-ins for a reason. They're not pushovers by any means, and of course, if we are going to talk about the series, we have to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Mad Lions Koi. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and unfortunately for GAM, this is basically exactly what I was talking about in my preview. I was talking about how Mad just had a few too many resources, and if they win in the early game, I just don't really see an opportunity for GAM to come back. I think it is way too imperative for GAM to actually gain pressure as quickly as they can in a game like this, and drafting Smolder Kaisa, I think in isolation is really fine. I like Smolder top. I like Smolder anywhere right now. I just think he's very inevitable. There's really no way to shut him off entirely. We've seen Korean teams be able to dominate in high-pressure games with something like Smolder because they can secure their, stacks and spots in the mid-game and not really allow him to be taken advantage of. But when you're playing against a team like Mad and when you yourself don't have the, let's just say the prowess necessary to be able to 1v1 in other situations, like with Akali versus Yone or having the Wukong move around the map, if you don't have that ability to survive in the early game, it doesn't really matter that you have any of those scaling tools. Mad Lions just has way too much pressure on the map, and you're never really able to come back. Even if fights start going well for you, so many fights have to start going well that it ends up being a lot more difficult to come back. And for Mad, you got Yone. Congratulations. Like, it becomes a lot easier when you get Yone on B1. I don't really understand why teams are continuously letting this champion through. I think he's now like 17-3 at this tournament. I'm not going to try and sit here and be like, oh, I was a genius for saying this. I remember obviously dying on the hill that Yone was the strongest champ in the game before the tournament. I think everybody was, or at least everybody should have. This was the most obvious thing that we could have possibly seen coming, especially after how much it dominated America's challengers even just a month ago or, whatever. But you know, we can't let this champ through. Like, at some point, we have to start understanding that there's no counter, there's no answer, there's no worthwhile trade. There is nothing in the game that is worth trading Yone for. So, you know, I think it's just ego from GAM. But I very much considered giving player of the game to Fresskowy because in the early game, he was definitely kind of the focal point. But I'm going to give it to Alvaro. I mean, this guy just continues to be everywhere on the map and continues to be a major presence in terms of creating action for Mad Lions. When you're talking about their go buttons, when you're talking about, I guess, kind of the heart and soul of the offensive engage that they create, Alvaro is the guy that does all of that. As much as I like Supa, as much as I think Fresskowy had a good game, Elyoya I think has had a good tournament. If they don't have Alvaro, this team is a lot more passive and generally I think doesn't get nearly as much done. So I just want to give him a lot of credit. He was the best player in the entire play-in stage without question. I don't think anybody's really debating that. And while it hasn't quite been smooth sailing so far in the main stage, I think a lot of that has to do with the matchups that they've drawn. I think against a team like GAM, yeah, someone like Alvaro can absolutely abuse Elio and Emo and Easy Love and Levi to an extent, as we saw in this game and we'll talk about. But great game from him. Fresskowy obviously deserves the shout out because the Yone was doing a billion damage in these fights and could do it entirely for free. Just ban him. Like, it's really not that hard. You just have to click the button. It's I don't understand. I'm not gonna go on this like long tangent, but yeah, ban Yone. There's no trade in the game that is worth it, genuinely. We have learned that over and over and over again. Elyoya was also really good in this game on the Maokai. I think his setups were actually exceptionally good and he took the Wukong out of the game. Basically every single fight, it was clear he had a purpose in terms of where he wanted to put his CC and his resources, we'll just say, in these 5v5s, and taking out the Wukong was definitely one of them. Mirwin was pretty bad for a majority of this game, but ended up getting a really big triple kill in a pretty pivotal fight that actually ended up turning the game back in favor of Mad Lions. Not that it was ever out of their favor, but it could have been a little bit bad if Mirwin wasn't collapsing and in a good spot to be able to clean that up. So the scoreline actually is indicative of a pretty big swing for his team, even if he did get solo killed in lane by a Smolder, which is never ideal. But outside of that, like, Supa was fine, got caught out a little bit more than maybe I would have liked, but was doing a ton of damage in this game. So Mad Lions just kind of playing through their own strengths and I think playing to their own win conditions, and that's really all you want to ask them to do. But for GAM, again, I think you're going too aggressive in terms of how you need to attack Mad Lions. Like, I love the idea of trying to win early. Smolder Kaisa obviously doesn't necessarily accomplish that, but things like Akali definitely can. The problem is I think you're putting pressure on the wrong players. You're hoping and praying not that Kiaya or that Easy Love even can win and generate leads in the early game. You're hoping that Emo can. You're hoping that Levi can move around the map and have more pressure than someone like Elyoya. I just think that you're investing into the wrong spots on the map. I like Akali, I like Wukong, I like this duo, I like their ability to play even against something like a Yone. I think a good Akali player could make it work. You just, again, don't have the players. You don't have the personnel to pull this off, and Levi was awful this game. He's going to get dud of the game for me. I don't really know what else to say. Like, this was a bad performance, and honestly, I have been kind of proven correct at this tournament in that he's fine as a jungler right now, but he's not the player that everybody wants him to be. I think this has been his weakest year in a little while, and I know this is his last year competing, and so I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but he's a good jungler right now. He's not a great jungler right now, and Elyoya definitely took advantage of that in terms of pathing. Now, it's a little bit harder when you have a bunch of losing lanes, and when your lane swaps aren't necessarily going in your favor, as we've seen with GAM. They just don't seem as comfortable in the lane swap meta as a lot of other teams because their top laner is their most important player, and so they can't quite play through him nearly as consistently, but you got to be better in terms of the engages, and you have to have better target prioritization in terms of the knockups and who you actually want to get on if you are going to play something like Wukong in the late game. I thought actually like Easy Love and Elio were fine. Elio actually had a pretty good game on the Rakan. It just didn't matter. Kiaya gets a solo kill on Mirwin, but can't really do much else on the Smolder. Obviously, there are pieces here. Like, there are positives. I'm not trying to sit here and say that there was nothing to take away from this for GAM, but you can see the stats. You can see the game time on your screen. Like, this wasn't exactly a close game. This wasn't back and forth. This wasn't, oh, GAM might have a chance to win. Mad Lions took an inhibitor tower at like 14 minutes into the game. Like, this was a stomp. You just had pieces that you can build on going into game number 2, but you have to. It's do or die. Obviously, it's a best of 3, so you're already on series point. If GAM loses game number 2, they are out of the tournament, and Mad would be moving on to the next round, but GAM, I'm sure, wants to push this to a deciding game number 3. Will they have the chance to? Well, the winner of game number 2 was GAM Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we are going to a deciding game number 3. This is disaster for Mad Lions. Obviously, losing a game isn't the end of the world as long as you come out of this series with a win, but this was not a particularly good look for them, and this was a great bounce back from GAM. There were quite a few mistakes coming in the mid game for GAM. I think just in terms of execution, their macro was actually pretty good, but man, some of their team fights were sloppy. Some of of their mechanics were actually really bad in this game, but it didn't matter. Not only did they have the more consistent comp, because they absolutely do, Mad Lions had all of their gold on Ahri, and we'll talk about that. That has not been a successful strategy so far at the World Championships. Every time any Ahri gets gold, that team immediately loses. It's actually insane. But the moment the GAM actually started landing their ultimates, the moment Emo and Kiaya and Easy Love actually started pairing up and actually, doing things in fights, it just completely ran out of gas for Mad Lions. There was no way for them to be able to get back into this game. So credit to GAM. I thought they played well. Not exactly the masterclass that maybe you would have hoped for, but all you need to do is win, and all you need to do is be better in the fights, and that's exactly what they were here. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game is pretty obviously going to go to Levi. There's really just not a lot of room for debate when it comes to that. This guy was like 6-0 or 7-0 or something at like 15, 20 minutes into the game. He got every single bit of early game EXP, and being able to fight through him and being able to fight through his ability to dive was actually gigantic for how GAM ended up playing out the rest of this game. As I said, you actually weren't landing a lot of abilities throughout a majority of this game. And so to have a champion that is both your consistent setup and your follow-through is actually very important and valuable for GAM in terms of being able to stabilize their early-late game and actually get them to the part where they could actually start hitting their abilities, and Levi was the guy to do that. There was a pretty gigantic jungle gap in this game, in my opinion. He was very much focused on trying to make sure bot lane had a really hard time, and we'll talk about it. Bot lane was not particularly good on the side of Mad Lions, and eventually Easy Love ended up getting online and being able to land a lot of these big Misfortune ultimates and really started to change a lot of the trajectory of this game, but Levi was really the one who set a lot of that up. It's funny because I was just complaining about him in the previous game. I wouldn't say complaining, but I was talking about how he was just fine, like not exceptional, just okay for this team in the previous game, and he shuts me up real quick. This was an exceptionally good performance and one that I think this team kind of desperately needed, but Easy Love and Elio were definitely the other two players that you have to shout out. The bullet times were gigantic. Frescowie was basically spending all of his gold on hoping and praying that he could get onto the backline and interrupt the MF during the ultimate cast, and for the most part, as the game went further and further along, while he was able to do it, oftentimes he was doing it at the cost of his own life and not really accomplishing anything else. And if that's where all the gold is on the other side of the map, then those fights become a lot easier. So credit to Easy Love when he was able to get those ultimates off. He was absolutely shredding through the front line. You don't really have like a true frontliner on Mad Lions. You've got the Vi, you've got the Rakan, like you don't have anybody that's going to be able to survive a Misfortune ultimate all that easily. So credit to Easy Love, and Elio I thought was excellent. A couple of great engages, one specifically in the bottom river near the end of the game that really kind of swung the tide in the favor of GAM. I thought the Rel was very valuable, and we continue to see that Rel as a champion individually is probably the strongest support in the game. Kiaya was fine, Emo was not fine, but they were good enough for you to be able to win. It's funny because Kiaya is usually kind of the hard carry, the execution monster on this team, especially in the laning phase, but the Kennen really didn't do anything. I've kind of called Rumble the new Kennen in terms of like just this game-breaking teamfight ultimate and really consistent damage. If you get anything in lane out of them, it's like a huge plus, but I don't think Kennen is particularly good right now. Kiaya kind of showed that if he does land his abilities, Kennen can actually still do a lot. I don't think this was the champion's fault, but boy howdy did he like whiff a lot of ultimates on Kennen, which is really just not an ideal set of circumstances in some of these fights, but not nearly as many ultimates whiffed as Emo in the mid lane. Yone is crazy broken, and yes, this is yet another win for Yone, but boy did he try to not win this one. Eventually he got so strong that he could just auto attack people to death and it wouldn't end up mattering, but he missed like 4 or 5 ultimates in this game. Like he just completely whiffed them. Genuinely insane. Emo has been horrendously bad at this tournament. He was horrendously bad at MSI. It is what it is. Mid lane is definitely a weakness for GAM, but Levi was definitely good enough in the jungle to be able to substitute that, and Easy Love and Elio I thought had a really good game down on the bot side as well, and they keep their hopes alive, which is all that really matters at the end of the day. But for Mad, I don't necessarily know where to point the blame in terms of this game, because a lot ended up going wrong in the back half. Like, these scorelines look miserably bad, but for most of this game, it really wasn't all that out of the question for them to come back and win. I think they have the tools necessary in order to win a team fight. I don't think this draft is unwinnable. I think the problem is that all of the gold went onto Ahri, and this is something I do want to talk about. Ahri has really not been effective at all at this tournament. People are still prioritizing her very highly, and I think Ahri individually is an okay champion, but what we're seeing is that, like, if you put your gold into Ahri in the early game, like, you have absolutely nothing in the late game. Ahri is just not enough damage for you to ever be able to actually, like, find picks consistently, especially in this meta where it seems like everybody's just grouping all the time. It doesn't really feel like Ahri plus Vi as this hyper pick comp trying to find these big mid-game advantages. It doesn't feel like that is a consistent enough way to actually end the game or to push your own advantages. It's really hard to generate a lead big enough from that strategy in order to win, which is why she has such a miserable win rate at this tournament. It's very, very strange range. I think it definitely shows on tape. Like, the moment Ahri becomes the primary option for a team, it just feels unwinnable. So, Frescowy obviously made some mistakes. I don't actually think he played all that well in this game. I think he was really good in the first 15 minutes, and I think he was really bad in the last 10 or so. I did not see a lot of good gameplay from Frescowy in the back half, and he's really been making a lot of mistakes at this tournament, but he should have had enough damage to be able to win this game for them, and he was doing nothing in these team fights. So I don't really know if that's a player or a champ diff, but we've seen this a couple of times now with Ahri. It just doesn't seem like this comp ends up working, especially on red side when you're giving over things like Yone. Dud of the game, though, is going to go to Elyoya. I think you could give this to Supa. It's got to go to one of the two. Supa ended up getting caught out a lot, mostly, in my opinion, because the enemy team was just really focused on trying to get the Xayah dead. He was out of position a couple of times, do not get me wrong, but this is a tough game to play out if you're Xayah. The Yone's diving on top of you, the Kennen's diving on top of you. If you don't get hit by either of those, you're likely going to have the Wukong or the Rel, and then obviously MF ult that you have to dodge. Like, you can only ult once. It's really difficult to stop everything here, as long as they layer and time it correctly, which by the end of the game they were doing. So I'm not going to blame Supa entirely, although I do think he needs to have better games than this. This was not a good enough game. His positioning was too far forward. He was too aggressive at times, and he got punished a lot for it. But Elyoya was worse to me. This was a pretty big jungle gap. He had no pressure in the early game, and we talk about it all the time, especially for these two junglers. Snowballing it, way too important. Being able to get items and get gold so that you can actually survive a long time in these fights is just so essential, and Elyoya just wasn't really able to do that. His team fighting was really bad, and so you just kind of have to live with that. Mirwin wasn't particularly relevant either. Alvaro didn't get to do anything nearly as well as he did in game number 1, so Mad Lions dropping game 2, not the end of the world, so long as they can clean up these mistakes. Again, if they go on and lose game number 3, it is a disaster. They are incredibly disappointing at this World Championship if they do end up losing game 3. I say that, but they were amazing in the play-in stage, so it's very difficult to get that read, but they need to beat GAM. GAM is playing with house money at this point. If they end up winning this series, that's gigantic, but if they're the first team out of the main stage, no one's going to be particularly surprised. It's going to be interesting to see how things move forward, but one team will be moving on, and one team will be eliminated as winner take all in this game number 3. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was GAM Esports. Of course they win game number 3. Of course they are going to take this series 2-1. And of course Mad Lions is going to be our first team officially eliminated from the main stage of Worlds in 2024. How could it have possibly gone any other way? Honestly, it's my fault for predicting anything else. It really genuinely is just me being ignorant to think this series would have gone any other way. This is, of course, how things go, especially giving over Yone, drafting Ahri mid on R3 with no setup. Like, this is, of course, the game that would happen in game number 3 to end up with a GAM win. This is ridiculous. I don't know how we got here. I mean, I know how we got here. I watched the game, and I'll talk about it. They just got all of these plays done in the early game. They get out to this gigantic early lead through Kalista and Nocturne and Aurora and Ahri and a lot of this, pick skirmish-oriented kind of comp, and Mad Lions opts into it for some reason because they just don't really seem to have any sort of idea of how to play around the champions that they drafted. But, how did we get here in the first place? How was GAM given an opportunity to be able to win this game at all? It's genuinely insane. There's a lot to talk about. This is obviously a little bit funny just because it's Mad Lions, and this is, kind of the meme, right? Is they're the first team out of Worlds, they get to Worlds and they underperform, yada, yada, yada. I want to say, I don't think this is an underperformance for Mad Lions. I mean, we had this team in the same tier as GAM going into this tournament, the D tier. This was a team that was supposed to make it out of play-ins and do nothing in the main stage. I just think losing to GAM is obviously disappointing, but them having this result isn't the worst thing in the world. I think that there have been bigger underperformances from LEC teams in the past at the World Championships. This is at least in the realm of possibility for expectations in terms of how talented this team is, but this is so good for GAM. Like, I don't want to sit here and talk about Mad for forever. I want to talk about GAM and talk about how they picked up a best-of-3 win and in the main stage against a major region team in their last year existing as a member of the VCS. And so, congratulations to them. This is just terrific stuff. Kiaya is player of the game. I didn't really have to think about this all that much. This Aurora was unstoppable. I want to talk about it because I've been very critical of teams letting Yone through draft, and I'm still critical of, letting Yone through draft, but if there is an exception, if there is one circumstance in which I think it is kind of justifiable to give over that Yone in draft is if you get to trade it for the Aurora on the other side. I think Aurora is the only other pick in the meta that's even remotely in the same tier as Yone in terms of power right now. I think we've seen that over the course of the play-ins when teams were actually getting this champion. In the main stage, it's been permabanned because I think teams realized, like watching the play-ins and just generally scrimming a lot, that Aurora is still busted, and I was very wrong about Aurora. I thought her numbers were just way too low. I thought she wasn't going to be particularly playable, but this champ just does so much. I mean, the kit is so inherently good. Finding picks on this champion is so easy, and when you have a player like Kiaya, who's clearly very practiced and very good at Aurora, as we saw on the play-in stage as well, you just have these very bad game states for the opponent, and Kiaya got mega fed in this game. He was excellent. I continue to die on this hill. He would be a top 1 or top 2 top laner in the LCS or LEC right now. Like, he's not just good as a top laner in the VCS. Like, he's not just one of those, oh, you know, he is very strong, like, for the region. He comes to Worlds and he can perform well on a certain pick and, you know, do well on certain days. No, like, this guy would be an all-pro regularly in the Western regions. He is better than most LCS and most LEC top laners. I think he could be borderline top 5 or top 6 in the LPL or the LCK, like maybe even higher than that in the LCK, right? Because the top lane pool is just not all that deep right now in either of those regions. Like, I genuinely think this guy could be a world-beating type of player, somebody who goes to a major region and genuinely dominates, but it's cool to see him stay in the VCS. It's cool to see him stay here on GAM for so long and continue to really elevate this team. He is the best player on GAM, regardless of what the narrative ends up stating about Levi. I like Levi, and we'll get into it. He's player of the series as a whole. I'm certainly not trying to downplay how important he was towards the success of this team in this series, but Kiaya is the best player. When you're talking about the player that needs to step up for them to win, Kiaya is the most talented player the VCS has ever seen, and it's not even halfway close. Like, he is genuinely just a ridiculous talent. But like I said, Levi is actually going to pick up my player of the series as a whole. Really couldn't go any other way after game number 2. He was still very valuable in game 3 here on the Nocturne. Kind of his signature pick, the one that a lot of people remember him for. You know, obviously the Shyvana has definitely turned into a signature pick this year, but Nocturne was the famous one that got GAM the major upsets back in the day. So obviously, Levi had to pull it out here and potentially there hit, you know, his last game as it was kind of projected to be, but picking up a victory on it makes it even sweeter. Nocturne Ahri is something that I've been very critical of. Nocturne's actually performed a lot better than I expected at this tournament, but Ahri has been certainly a question mark, and I think this idea of wanting to build around a pick comp was something that was inherently flawed to me, and I thought they lost in draft. I genuinely thought this game was unwinnable for them in terms of the draft, unless the Aurora got fed, and obviously more than that happened. Like, Easy Love and Elio had a really good early game. He got super fed. Easy Love, that is. Levi and Emo, I think, did a really good job of being able to express their tempo through the middle of the map, but, you know, it wasn't what I anticipated. You have to get an early lead with this comp, and I think pigeonholing yourself into that predicament is not necessarily ideal, and yet it still ended up working out. So credit to the stars of GAM, the faces of the entire league, quite frankly, when it comes to the VCS, and Kiaya and Levi for being able to step up and being the central players for the team in this series. Like I said, I do want to give a big shout out to Easy Love and Elio. Elio at times was a little bit questionable on the Braum in terms of just I guess burning a lot of his cooldowns. He was very aggressive and just like blocking random Qs and not having his shield up for some pretty important actual trades, but it just didn't seem like he was super comfortable on the champion. It didn't matter. Easy Love was so fed because of some early skirmishes, and Easy Love had a great series. He's had a great tournament. This guy's actually very good. I hope people start to wake up to him. I'm not going to sit here and say that he's a superstar or anything like Kiaya is, but he has very much impressed me, and his tape impressed me before the tournament as well. I talked about that in my pre-tournament power ranking, so I like Easy Love, and I think he's lived up to the hype for me. And then for Emo in the mid lane, this was easily the best game that he has played this entire tournament. He has really been a huge weakness for GAM. He has been kind of a hindrance to the team as a whole, and this was actually a really good Ahri game. There were multiple moments where he was diving onto the backline, hitting crucial charms onto Supa, burning his cleanse, and really forcing him to play further back. And generally, Supa was the win condition for Matt. He was playing excellent on the other side. We'll get into that in just a second, but Emo was a big disruptor and was very important towards that. I think that's the perfect role for Ahri. If you want Ahri to be like super useful, you can't have her be the big resource carry. You can't give her all the gold because then your team's just not going to have enough damage. But if you use her as a big disruptor, you know, an assassin on the backline that causes havoc and then creates space for things like Aurora and Callista to be able to win the fights themselves, that's where I think Ahri really thrives as a champion. So for GAM, congratulations. You're going to be moving on to the next round. You're going to get to play another best of 3. Obviously, it still feels like a pipe dream for them to be able to get anywhere close to getting out of the actual main stage, but the fact that they won a best of 3 against a major region team, that has to feel like a a gigantic accomplishment here. And then for Mad, I don't even really know what to say when it comes to this team. People are going to sit here and talk about how horrible this org is, how awful they are at investing in players, and they're clearly choosing the wrong ones, or, you know, this org is cursed or whatever. We never want to send Mad Lions to Worlds again, yada, yada, yada. Like, there's a lot of conversation surrounding Mad, and I just want to say, if you are an org and a team that can consistently go to Worlds for like 4 straight years, the noise is irrelevant. Like, in my eyes, like, this is a young core that has done way more than anyone could have ever expected in year 1. And honestly, there were a couple of players in this game that played, I mean, Supa played amazing in this game on the Kai'Sa. I know I sometimes get called a Supa glazer, but I mean, come on, like, you have to really hate Supa to not point out how good he was in this game. Like, you'd really have to have an agenda against him. He was excellent, and he did everything he could have in order to try to keep Mad Lions in this game, but this was a 1v9, like, in terms of what the options were. Fresskowy was just not really in this game on the Yone. He got taken out early, and, you know, Yone should be a lot more relevant than this, but Fresskowy has just not been good enough across this tournament. He was the biggest weakness, in my opinion, on this team. Mirwin was definitely the other gigantic weakness for them. The solo laners were just so far behind in this game. Mirwin got completely outplayed by Kiaya in the final one. And generally speaking, when you're talking about this tournament run, it really wasn't the bot lane, it really wasn't jungle, it was the solo laners that were kind of the disappointing members of Mad Lions, and that's kind of exactly what we predicted for this team going into this tournament, is that Fresskowy and Mirwin just weren't going to be able to hold up against world-class competition in terms of those roles. They were already very questionable 1v1 in lane domestically, and I thought it would get even worse when they went internationally, and unfortunately, I was proven correct. Mirwin just wasn't good enough on this blind pick Gnar, and Fresskowy got the strongest pick in the game and ended up getting out-pressured by an Ahri. It's just not ideal. Elyoya also struggled quite a bit in the back half of some of these games, although I don't think this one was his fault. Generally, Alvaro is going to get dead of the game, though, for me. I just feel weird because Alvaro had such a good tournament. Like, I don't want to end his tournament coverage on such a down note because I think there are way too many encouraging signs for me to be like, oh, Alvaro cost it for them. But he was out of position a lot in this game. He was just walking up for basically no reason, kind of pulling the EU support trick of just dying in the jungle without any wards. And it's like, okay, well, what exactly were you attempting to do in these instances? Just very strange play, but Supa, very, very good. And I think there are so many good takeaways for Mad when it comes to this World Championships. I think the bot lane has really shown that they can be world beaters if they continue to grow. Elyoya is obviously a really good player, and there is some growth potential. I think Mirwin actually was pretty good for a majority of this tournament, but Fresskowy, you know, definitely needed to step up, I think, a bit more, and Mirwin got gapped, quite frankly, in this series by Kiaya. He just was the worst of the two top laners, which I think is something that needs to improve for a major region top laner, but overall, a lot of building blocks, and I think Mad Lions going into next year is going to be just fine. This is likely going to be a favorite for Worlds again, especially with all the rumors of the LEC rosters being even more budget than they were this year. So, you know, we'll have to see what ends up happening with Mad Lions. But again, I'm not going to sit here and criticize an organization that is consistently making Worlds when you have so many orgs in the LEC that can't even get a sniff of trying to even make the tournament. So for Mad, yes, they're out, but this isn't the worst thing in the world. And then for GAM, this is the best thing in the world. This is best case scenario. This is everything you could have ever asked for if you were GAM. This is about as exciting as it gets. And obviously their tournament run's not over. We'll see what happens to them in the next round. But whatever happens, I think they're going to look back on this victory and see a lot of positives. But then moving on now to our second series of the day, and this is an America's Clash. This could be a preview of what we're seeing potentially near the end of next year in terms of international importance. It's a #1 seed from the CBLOL in Pain Gaming, taking on the #2 seed from the LCS in Team Liquid. This is an exciting matchup for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the storyline of the CBLOL taking on the LCS is always a good story, but especially this year, it's ramped up quite a bit in terms of rivalry, but both of these teams have looked very different, I would say, coming into these games. Pain, obviously, being a CBLOL representative, they're exactly what you think they would be. I would say they're a very balanced team. They don't necessarily have one star player that has been taking over. Titan is definitely the closest that they have to something like that, but this is a very well-rounded team in terms of where their resources could go, and they use that well-roundedness to fight all the time, everywhere. Every single lane is a power lane for them all the time. They like to draft comps that have 3 winning lanes and really just play for trying to get early leads. They're not really all that focused on trying to win team fights down the stretch of these games. They can do that. They're certainly talented enough to be able to win, but It's not been a priority for them in terms of mentality or in terms of drafting and how they want to go about these games. And a couple of players have really impressed me. Obviously, Titan's impressed everybody, but Weiser has been exceptionally good on the top side for Pain throughout this tournament. We'll see if that continues here because they're going up against Team Liquid. Obviously, a team that's coming from a very different perspective. This is a team that has looked very good at times against some of the better teams in this tournament. They've taken on LNG, they've taken on Weibo Gaming, and they've had leads in both of those games. They've just not been able to hang on to either of them, and really, this team looks tilted out of their minds. They're the better team of these two, but I think if they are not locked in mentally, that could be a huge problem. You look at some of these matchups and you don't see like ridiculously big advantages. I think obviously the one that everybody's going to point to first is Titan versus Yan. I think that is definitely the most noticeable, and even just generally Titan and Curry versus Yan and Core JJ, that's definitely the matchup that I think a lot of people are going to gravitate towards. But Weiser versus Impact is going to be pretty ginormous on the top side for me, so long as we don't get like extended lane swaps, as long as both of them are actually allowed to play the game. Because honestly, Impact's not been very good at this tournament, and as I've said in the past, people tend to forget because he's so good domestically, but Impact's international track record as a North American player is actually not very good. He has not been very good at Worlds and at MSIs. He was pretty good at MSI this year. I think it was one of his better international performances in a while, but this decade at the very least, in the 2020s, he's really not been very good at Worlds. It's actually been a bit of a concern for me. I've talked about it a lot on this channel, and so, you know, we'll see if that continues to be a bit of a problem. The lane swaps were something he really thrived in because he could survive so effortlessly on multiple sides of the map, but it doesn't really necessarily seem to be as much of the case here internationally, with talent kind of rising around the lead or around the competition. So we'll see what ends up happening there. But again, I think whichever bot lane ends up getting super fed is going to have a major advantage in this series. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. and APA need to keep their heads locked in. They looked tilted beyond belief in the end of the Weibo Gaming game. They just felt like they were more affected by some of the bad things that were happening to the team, some of the mental mistakes, than the other players. I imagine players like Impact and Core are very calming in terms of being able to talk the team through hard moments, but you have to remember, APA is only at Worlds for the second time. He was a sub last year with basically no expectations. Now there are a ton of expectations. You have a player in who's never made Worlds before, and so there is a lot of uncertainty around how this team is going to face adversity because they didn't really have to for a lot of this year, or at least for a lot of the summer split. So obviously, they are favorites going into this. If they were to lose this, that would be disastrous. That would be significantly worse, in my opinion, than Mad Lions losing to GAM. I think that's significantly more understandable. Team Liquid going 0-3 and dropping out to a minor region team is unacceptable. So we'll see what ends up happening between these two, but the only way to know is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and you would like it to have been fun, and you would have liked it to have been a good game for Team Liquid, but honestly, this is one of the worst games of the entire tournament in terms of gameplay, in terms of skill from both of these teams, and definitely in terms of decision-making. This was a very bad game, not only from Pain, but from Team Liquid. I think both teams played pretty horrific in this one. I just tweeted out, it's a bad day to have eyes, because genuinely that's how I felt watching this game number 1. It was just mistake after mistake after mistake. The question was not who was going to win the game, it was who was going to lose harder in this game, and that's just never fun to see on the international stage. And I think generally you can point to basically everybody really underperforming, but Liquid luckily is going to be able to come out on top in a 1v9. Like, truly, at the end of the day, we talked about Pain being a very balanced team. I think that very much came through here in game number 1, but it's Yan. It's literally Yan 1v9ing. He's player of the game. If Team Liquid win this series, he's going to get player of the series. I'm spoiling it now. I'm recording this before game 2, so I don't know what's going to happen, but Yan, no matter what happens, like, he is the reason that they have a chance in this series, because, oh my god, this was a carry performance. There were players on this team that were doing their absolute best to win trade this game away. Impact was horrible. was horrible. APA made countless mistakes, and yet here we were on the Kaisa with Yan just winning every single fight, constantly 1v9ing, doing a billion damage, diving into the backline, blowing up Orianna and Ezreal by himself. Like, this was a ridiculous game from Yan, and I think it might even go undersold just how good he was in this one, because yes, Pain made a lot of mistakes. Their macro was very sloppy. They were so scared to make decisions against Team Liquid, even when they probably should have taken like a gold lead for Team Liquid and turned it around in 2 seconds with any sort of decision making. But Jan was able to completely obliterate them in every single team fight, and you have to give him credit for that. I think without him in this game, I don't think Team Liquid win this. I think if you put an average AD carry in here, again, I really don't think Team Liquid have a shot at being able to win this game. They only were able to win because Jan was so strong and because he was so effective with that gold and with those resources. And I know I sometimes get flack in the comments for, hyping up my takes for too long, but golly, did I die on the hill all year long of Jan being the best player on Team Liquid. I really was like, this guy is like way better than he gets credit for. Core is getting a lot of the credit for things that I think Jan is doing in lane. I think Jan is much improved as a team fighter. That was always his weakness, but go look at this game. He literally 1v9'd in these team fights, and that was supposedly his weakness. He's always been one of the best laners in the West, regardless of role or anything like that. He is able to dominate the 2v2 more effectively than anyone in the lane swap meta. It's kind of taken away some of his shine, but he's still really good in it because he's able to get more resources than a lot of other AD carries would in his position, and as good as Impact has been for a lot of this year, I think Jan has been more valuable as a strict carry. And so even if Impact was like an MVP, like you look at their playoff runs and Jan is the guy that they're playing through. Jan is the one they're investing a lot of resources into, and he's really making it worth it here. We'll get to Impact in a second, I promise, but I can't oversell Jan enough to you. Like, if you are somebody who doesn't believe in him or hasn't watched a lot of Team Liquid over the course of this year, maybe is just tuning into my coverage for Worlds and hasn't watched my LCS coverage, believe in Jan. Believe in this guy because he is genuinely a generational talent at the AD carry role, and I'm really happy to have been right about that. And the reason I have to go on that tangent and really go on that run is because you look at the rest of this team and how they played in this game, and it wasn't particularly good. Like, Core, I guess, generally was fine, although I don't think some of the calls and decisions that he was a part of were particularly good. Some dives in the top lane that were just really, really dumb, like really not good decisions, and they end up getting hyper punished for. Better teams would have taken those mistakes and blown them into 2,000 gold swings, but obviously Pain just wasn't good enough to be able to do that. But just forgetting to use Smite and getting a dragon stolen by Ezreal only for Pain to get soul later in the game because of it. You have APA, who's just constantly out of position, being way too far forward, over aggressive, not connecting with the rest of his team, trying to play hero ball on an Ahri pick that already has shown that it cannot be a primary carry at this tournament. And then you have Impact in the top lane, who's actually going to get my dud of the game. The dud of the game is going to stay on the winning side here because Impact was super useless in this game. I mean, he was down like a ridiculous amount of CS in the early game because of just a lot of the circumstances. Obviously, Team Liquid's usually pretty good in lane swaps, but Impact did not handle it well in this game. And then the moment he did actually get into lane with Gnar, he was getting bullied, like completely brutalized. And I get this isn't the easiest matchup in the entire world, but if you're going to B1 Jax, especially because you have a skin on the champion, you gotta be relevant, like in some way, shape, or form. And quite frankly, Impact was by far the worst player in this game. I talked about it a bit before in the preview, but Impact's track record historically at international events after T1, after the SKT era, not good. Like, it's really not actually all that good. You can go back and look at some of the results, and not only the results, but the tape on some of those games. He's really not been that great of a Worlds player over the course of his career. And so, I'm not going to say I'm worried, but we'll see, right? Like, this is just another kind of feather in the cap of, like, Impact really struggling internationally when he has to play these players that are more aggressive. The LCS is not known for having good top laners, and I think, we might have just overhyped a player who was dominating a lot of average guys, like in the LCS, quite frankly. I'm not saying that Impact is great, but I certainly don't want to see him on Jax again. Put him on a tank. That's where he's comfortable, and clearly that's where he's going to perform on an international level. But Team Liquid's going to feel very lucky to walk out of this having beaten a Pain Gaming Nocturne Orianna Ezreal combo with Ocean Soul, just purely because Kai'Sa was so strong and Jan was so good in these fights. So credit to Team Liquid. I guess credit to Jan, who really was the winner of this game. But for Pain, you had so many opportunities to take Team Liquid's mistakes and blow them up. You pick off 4 members after Team Liquid makes this horrible call to go for Baron and flip it 50-50. They do get it, luckily. If they don't get that smite, the game is genuinely over, but Pain picks off 4 members. They have free soul point, and they don't even take it. They literally just back and AFK. Obviously, it's never punished because Team Liquid just allows them to have it 2 minutes later anyways when they could have fought over it, but it's just so weird. Like, it felt like neither team really wanted to win this. It felt like Pain had no idea how to actually, like, get gold in this game, and even though there were good individual plays from, like, Titan stealing that dragon, which was big, I think Jinkedo probably had one of his better games in a while. This guy's been obliterated in lane 1v1 against everybody, including play-ins at this tournament, and that didn't necessarily happen here either. Weiser had a really good early game here on the Gnar, didn't really do anything in the late game. Like, Karioka couldn't really do anything out of the jungle. The Nocturne felt pretty irrelevant. Like, the macro of Pain was horrific. I think the gameplay of Pain was generally fine. Some of the fights actually were okay, but, you know, I just don't feel good about either of these teams walking out of this. This was a really poor game from both of them. Poorly played, poorly executed. Hopefully Game 2 is better. I mean, Pain obviously has to bounce back. They're one game away from elimination, but Team Liquid now is sitting on the verge of hopefully getting their first, you know, actual win of the tournament. They got the first game win of the tournament here, but picking up a Game 2 win would definitely, hopefully, revitalize some of the confidence that this team had, because them losing it has completely destroyed their ability to play the map. So, big game for both of these teams. Is Pain going to be eliminated? Are they going to join Mad Lions? Or are they going to kind of match their minor region counterpart in GAM and send us to a game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series 2-0, and they will be moving on. And unfortunately, that means it is the end of the road for Pain Gaming. Obviously, this was expected. If this had gone any other way, it would have been a gigantic upset. We already talked about it. Like, Team Liquid is better than Mad Lions, and their expectations are significantly higher than Mad Lions. It would not be the same as Mad losing here today. Mad was a play-in team that, you know, obviously people felt pretty good about after the play-ins because they looked so good in the play-ins, but was inherently inconsistent, hadn't shown anything, obviously, internationally up until that point because they hadn't been anywhere internationally, and already were kind of, you know, just kind of a team that people weren't dying on. Like, they weren't dying on the Mad Lions hill. Team Liquid, I think people have real expectations for. This would have been a disaster if they ended up losing, and honestly, this wasn't a clean game either. This was not a good one. You know, game 1 was worse, I would say. This one, they definitely had more agency. They were actively, like, trying to make plays on their own rather than just hoping and praying that Pain makes a gigantic mistake or that they can get bailed out by Yon playing really well. This time, they were a little bit more coherent, I would say, in terms of their macro, even if it still was very bad, and even if there were a lot of points in this game where it felt like they were just straight up going to lose the game, even though they never should have been in that position in the first place with how fed their mid laner was. You know, all of those things can exist, and yet we can still look at game number 2 and say, it wasn't game 1. Like, there were definitely more encouraging signs, even if I still am very concerned about this team moving forward. Player of the game basically has to go to APA. There's basically no other answer to this, even though he didn't land a single good ultimate this entire game. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. He landed one really good ultimate towards the back half of the game in that, like, last fight, where he was able to land, I think, on 2 members. Fight was basically over already. I mean, it was already looking like it was going to be a win for Team Liquid, but still confirming that by APA getting onto the backline, getting that nice flank, and, you know, landing that was really huge. But the other ones, not so good. He whiffed a couple, got thwarted, I guess is the word I should use, on a couple. He ends up getting rooted by Jin around the Baron fight when he's trying to TP flank, and it just doesn't end up working out. He gets zoned out of the fight and ends up being almost entirely useless. That basically throws the entire lead away for Team Liquid, even though they get the Baron off of it. Very strange game, all things considered, but APA's damage was so relevant in the early and in the mid game, and it generated so much gold that you have to basically give it to him, even if he wasn't quite as effective in team fights. I'm still a lot lower on the Nico pick than I think a lot of other analysts. I just don't think it does enough damage to justify picking it over some other things that would generally take its spot. I think obviously as a lane bully, it's really good. It's really strong in the 1v1. You can play around it very easily in the mid game, and it causes headaches for the opponent because of counting minions and a lot of the weird Nico intricacies, right? But she's basically an ultimate at the end of the game, and if you have a lot of CC, like Pain do here with the Orianna, with the Jhin, with the Rel, you can pretty easily negate it, as we saw in this game. So even with APA playing well, like, Nico's still a champion that I'm not entirely sold on, but I have to give player of the series to Yon. I already said this in game number 1. It basically didn't matter what happened in game 2 as long as they won. Yon was getting player of the series because he is the only reason that they won game number 1, and he was still very good here in game number 2. He turns the tables here on Titan and actually gets the Dragonsteel himself with the Ezreal ultimate. It seems junglers are just inherently greedy. Very, very funny, but Yon was very, very good here, and honestly just is an awesome player. There's not a lot to talk about in terms of his effectiveness to the game. Most of his big plays were as a part of a group, you know, alongside the Nico, alongside the Leona, alongside the Skarner, etc., right? But Yon was still very good. He still executed his role very well. It wasn't just him being carried or anything like that. He was definitely the secondary damage source in a lot of these fights, and honestly, in that final fight that ended up closing out the game, he was super good. He did a ton of damage in that fight. So Yon continuing to level up, his team fighting is getting significantly more consistent game over game, and he is becoming the star of this team. I think also had a much better game here in game number 2. He felt a lot more focused on something like the Skarner. I just don't think Vi is the kind of champion that really works for him. I think it works for Team Liquid. I don't think needs to be that aggressive in the early game. That's why things like Sejuani and Maokai are so consistent for him, him, because so long as he's inevitable, so long as he doesn't feel the pressure to try to make plays all the time, he's not making bad plays, which generally the less has to make decisions for this team, typically the better. Core was fine, but not sensational throughout this game and throughout this series. He was generally just along for the ride. I actually think his game 1 was maybe a little bit more consistent than his game 2, but he was still fine here on the Leona. And then there's Impact on the top side, who got mega gapped by Weiser in both games. Like, this was a horrible series from Impact. He just did not look like he was a part of the team at all. This was a standard game, no lane swap at all from either side, and Impact still just lost in the 1v1 in the Gnar Renekton matchup, which is one of the most stable matchups in the entire game. So I don't really know. Impact is just not playing well. Again, he's got a pretty bad track record internationally. He's just been so good domestically that people forget about that, and so, you know, we'll keep an eye on it, but this was not a good showing from him, and he did not have a very good day. But luckily, the rest of the team was able to bail him out, and even though they made some horrible decisions, even though APA is still a player I'm very, very concerned about internationally after this series, you know, there's enough on this team that it makes me feel good enough that they're moving into 1 and 2, even if I don't know that they're going to go much further than that. And then for Pain Gaming on the other side, obviously, it feels bad to be eliminated from the tournament, to not win a single game in the main stage, going 0-4 in your 4 games, but the fact that you're here already is such an accomplishment. I don't want to understate how important that was for the CB LOL for them to make it out of play-ins. They were not projected to make it out of play-ins by anyone. I, in fact, got this very wrong. There are a lot of things I got right. There are some things I definitely got wrong, and I'm not afraid to own up to the things I got wrong. Pain, I got wrong. I had them last in my power rankings going into this tournament. I did not see it. Domestically, it felt like they didn't necessarily have a player that they could play through at a high level. T-Tom was the closest, but I was worried that the other bot lanes in the play-in stage were going to be too tough, and here we are, Pain making it to the main stage and actually, like, really pressuring Team Liquid, a team that not only is the number 2 seed from a major region, but also went to MSI and, like, beat Fnatic and, you know, actually contested teams like T1. Like, this is not some pushover of a team, and Pain Gaming stepped up and actually played them really tough and really hard. Nocturne Orianna is another thing that I think I've just been wrong about. I've been high on Orianna, low on Nocturne, and so generally I was kind of in the middle on the combo. This is just such a dangerous combo. I think this is by far the best way to play Nocturne. I honestly don't think there's much of a point to play him without Orianna, but when you get that, clearly I was just underestimating the power that you can do and the damage that Orianna can do, really without Nocturne even having to do all that much, just kind of being a delivery vessel for Orianna damage. So overall, I still think that combo is very good. There are positives. Weiser was incredible in this series, completely gapped Impact in every stage of the game, was better in lane, was better out of lane, was better in team fights. Just every stage of the game, Weiser was better than Impact, and that is a really cool thing to be able to say if you're Weiser. He had a phenomenal Worlds in 2024. Hopefully he can build upon that and we can see him more in the future. I think that Jinkedo was pretty good this game here on the Orianna, was doing a ton of damage by the end of the game, and the shockwaves actually were very useful in these fights. He just didn't have enough tempo to be able to win it on his own. Teton and Curry, I don't think, had a bad series by any means, but Karioka is going to get my dud of the game. Unfortunately, somebody has to get this, and the Nocturne, to me, was just the least valuable. This is the problem with Nocturne, is when you have to play from behind, he just doesn't really do any damage, and he's not really somebody that can assassinate on the backline because you have so much peel on the side of Team Liquid. There were times where it really worked. You're definitely going to be able to pinpoint 1 or 2 fights where it's like Nocturne diving onto the backline and Team Liquid not having an answer. I'm just saying for a majority of the game, and for the fights that really counted towards the back half, it was kind of a 5v4.5, because Nocturne was really only half a champion by that point in the game. So Karioka is going to get my dud of the game here, but again, Pain has absolutely nothing to be sad or frustrated about. This was a fantastic showing, a fantastic performance from a team that, quite frankly, should have never been in this position in the first place. This was a great send-off to the CB LOL, and unfortunately, NA had to be the one to close the door. And, you know, I think it's poetic, it's a bit apropos of the situation, but, you know, we'll see how things go moving forward for Team Liquid. They are now sitting at 1 and 2. The draw is going to happen in just a couple of minutes, and so we'll see what ends up happening. We'll see who they end up picking up, but at the end of the day, winning is all that matters. Even if this was a pretty horrendous series, they got the W, and they're going to be moving on. Alright, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2024 day number 5 overview and analysis video here in the Swiss stage. We have our draw for the next round, round number 4 of Worlds, up on the screen. You can see it, the 2-1, the 1-2, both of them have been drawn. The way that things work over the next weekend or so is that we are getting these in increments of 2 series apiece, 6 series in total, 3 days, you know, 2 series apiece, and then the final day, I believe, with all 3 best of 3 series on it at the end of the Swiss stage. So for now, I'm only going to be talking in depth about the 2-1 series because we're getting some combination, I believe, of the 2-1 series, but I guess I don't know that for sure. I guess I'll just talk about all of them, and then we'll just reiterate in the upcoming videos how I feel. But the draw itself, I think, is pretty great. I think generally speaking, it's hard to really mess up draw at this point. Every single team that's left in the tournament or is in their certain bracket is probably around the same skill level, or at least projected to be around the same skill level. You just probably want to dodge a couple of teams in particular, but I think the bad teams got the best teams, and I think that the even match teams are kind of playing against each other. So that's kind of the good draw here on the 2-1 side, the upper side, the side that's trying to get into quarterfinals to join Gen.G and LNG. You've got D+ Kia taking on Top Esports. I think this is a great draw for Top Esports. D+ has really gotten lucky in terms of the opponents that they faced across this tournament so far. Fnatic, FlyQuest, very beatable teams. They had to face an actually good team in LNG, and they still really struggled to be able to generate anything. I think they will struggle even more against Top Esports, who I think is likely better than LNG. So Top Esports for me in this one, pretty easy call. G2 taking on T1. This is kind of a classic rivalry. These two teams have faced off a ton internationally. Caps versus Faker has become kind of a legendary matchup between the West and the East, probably the most legendary West versus East matchup, and I think G2 is in phenomenal form, but I think T1 is also in phenomenal form. I think this is maybe the closest matchup of the entire upcoming weekend. I think it's going to be really telling depending on who wins this, but I'm going to lean slightly in favor of T1. I know that's going to maybe make some G2 fans a little mad, but I think T1's in great form. I think their win over Bilibili proved that they are, right now, one of the better teams in the world. They're playing like, in my opinion, one of the top 4 to 5 teams at this tournament, and while G2 are in that conversation as well, I just have a little bit more faith that T1 at Worlds is going to keep that power up going. G2 struggles in a couple of areas that I think T1 could exploit, most notably the bot lane in the early 2v2, so we'll see what ends up happening, but I think T1 will take this. That's my prediction, even if I think it's the closest of the series here. Then we have Hanwha versus FlyQuest as the final 2-1 matchup, and this is what I was talking about, the best team in the 2-1 bracket in Hanwha Life Esports taking on the worst team in the 2-1 bracket in FlyQuest. This should be a very easy HLE win, and they should be going on to the quarterfinals. They gave Gen.G a real run for their money. I think this is the second best team in the world at the current moment, and I think they're not going to have a ton of trouble with Fly. Fly still has a chance in the 2-2 bracket, obviously, to be able to make it through to the quarterfinals. There are multiple draws, in my opinion, that would get them there, depending on the results and even the favorites in series like that, but I don't think it's going to happen here in 2-1. And then the 1-2 side, quickly going over it, we've got Team Liquid taking on GAM. This is a dream draw for Team Liquid, but kind of recompense after drawing LNG and Weibo Gaming as their first 2 opponents. I think they should be able to take down GAM, even though GAM looks really good right now. I think Mad had a ton of problems, and obviously Elyoya talked quite extensively in their post-game interview about how they were prepping for bigger teams than GAM, and if they ended up falling to GAM, it wouldn't have mattered to them, because if they couldn't beat Weibo Gaming or whatever in the next round, then what was even the point of it anyways? So I get it, but Mad wasn't like fully there. I think GAM, still a team that I'm expecting to drop out here, and I think Team Liquid is good enough, and hopefully they got enough confidence from their win over Pain Gaming to play any better, because I'll be honest, if they play the way they did against Pain, I'm not sure they win this series, but I expect them to be better, so I'm predicting them here. Then you've got Weibo Gaming taking on Fnatic, a battle of 2 very aggressive teams in the early game. I think this is very much going to come down to who ends up getting early leads and early advantages, but to me, that's probably going to be Weibo Gaming. I think that they are more talented. I think this team has not shown up quite yet at Worlds. Hopefully that development starts happening. Like, they beat Team Liquid, which is obviously nice, but they didn't exactly look the way I thought they would in that game. They probably should have lost it, but Team Liquid lost it even harder. We'll see. I think Weibo can get back on track. I think Fnatic is a team that is very beatable. I don't think that they are super scary at this tournament or anything, and so Weibo are definitely favorites, but this is not a lock by any means. And then, the obvious one of the 1-2 bracket, Bilibili Gaming taking on PSG Talon. Poor PSG Talon ends up drawing the short end of the stick here, having to face Bilibili. They're out in this 1-2 stage. BLG is not going to be losing to PSG Talon. I will say that they've looked significantly more concerning across this tournament than they have at any tournament this entire year. They were really good at MSI. They were really good domestically, back-to-back champions, and yet here we are, like, actually questioning them. This is their first best of 3. I think they thrive in these best of 3, best of 5 scenarios, these long series, and so I don't imagine this is going to be tough for Bilibili. I think that they will get to 2-2, but brutal draw for PSG. I think 1-2 is still a good result for them, all things considered, but certainly not an ideal set of scenarios, and they're almost certainly out of the tournament here. So those are my predictions. Let me know if you agree or disagree with them down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of this tournament all the way through to the World Finals, and then we'll be covering the off-season after that. All the roster moves that are already starting to get announced, we'll be talking about about on the channel. So if you're interested in that stuff, if you're interested in the tournament coverage that I'll be doing for the rest of the month, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all